Darkcore Frontiers, Season 1, The Stowaway, by Thomas Chase. Episode 1, The Wanderer of the Stars, Orbit 7 Space Station, Osirian Prime, Quintus System. Nex squinted up at the massive supply ship from the shadow of a stack of pallets near kilometer marker 15. The catwalks were alive with hundreds of blue, yellow, and red engineers, technicians, and dock workers scurrying over scaffolding and zooming in and out on flight packs. This supply fleet was Nex's ride out of there, his ticket to freedom. But really, he was just trying to keep breathing, keep moving, and not get caught. For the occasion, he was dressed in a blue engineer's standard issue uniform. It was the smallest size he could find, but it hung across his grease-smeared hands and spilled over his boots. His yellow hair poked out from beneath the oversized headgear.
Ready, Nex?
He took a deep breath and adjusted the strap of his bulky backpack.
Okay, here we go.
The plan was simple, but also kind of dangerous. Nex needed to sneak aboard one of the 7 ships and hide until the fleet blasted off. Once in space, the real fun would begin, meaning he would have the freedom to explore and, hopefully, eat. Nex moved swiftly and as silently as he could. He hung close to walls to avoid the dock workers and ducked to miss a mobile supervisory platform bobbling by. Reaching the docking area where the towering airlocks of the supply ships rose before him, he stopped. Each ship was marked with a unique identifier, and Nex had already picked his target, the SS Horizon, a ship bound for the distant Earth colonies of Theta 9. It was the lead ship in the fleet, which meant it could be occupied by a manned crew and would have the ability to override the directives of the other ships. Most importantly, its primary cargo was food. This section of the docking platform of Orbit 7 was tricky. It was crowded with knots of logistics teams, tall dock worker droids, and supply chain managers making final checks of all containers and equipment. It was also under almost constant watch from observation decks, glassed-in bulb-like domes that hovered above the fracas. Maybe Nex should have been used to this by now, but this scene still got his insides in a knot. Crowds were not his thing, at all. He'd had his share of close calls navigating various docking areas throughout the galaxy. A few times, more than he preferred to count, he had not been quite so lucky. Swallowing hard, Nex stepped out into the open. As he approached the SS Horizon, he spotted a team of blue-clad engineers walking briskly toward an open maintenance hatch near the rear of the ship. He fell into step closely behind them. Focusing out the colorful blur of movement on his left and right, Nex locked his eyes onto the engineer's boots in front of him. He might have looked silly to anyone who happened to observe him. An awkwardly short engineer in an oversized uniform carrying a backpack almost half his own weight, straggling along behind the group like a toddler running after a line of grown-ups. His best chance here was the heavy bustle of activity. He hoped this group was moving fast enough to get him through the open space in a few seconds. As they mounted the steep ramp, Nex struggled to keep from sliding back down on the cuffs of his jumpsuit, but somehow, miraculously, he made it up and into the ship in one piece. Once inside, out of view of the observation decks, he quickly dropped off the group of engineers and dove into the first alcove he came to, a small emergency response station. He glanced around. No voices, no alarms, no lights. Silence. Okay, he was in. Nex hunched against a soft metal bulkhead over a rack of fire extinguishers and took a moment to allow his pounding chest to slow. Turning his gaze up to the map posted above the station, he noted his current location. Sure, it would be nice to catch his breath for a second, but nope, he had to keep moving. In this spot, he was probably both under observation from a security camera and in the pre-programmed patrol path of a security droid. Looking around the empty main corridor, he pulled up the pesky bottoms of his trousers and hefted his backpack once more. He shut off all those what-if scenarios whizzing through his mind, took a deep breath, put his shoulders back, tried to look like he was supposed to be there, like he was just another crew member. definitely not a teenage Zraynian stowaway. As he strode along, passing occasional loading crews who did not spare him a second glance, out of the corner of his eye he counted the shiny, pitted black hornet-like faces of the security cameras mounted in the ceiling. Nex had learned that looking directly at one could catch the trained eye of an astute security monitor. He slipped through a hatch and into a dark maintenance corridor. The narrow passage was filled with pipes and conduits. So far, so good. But Nex had to find a more secure hiding spot before the final checks were completed. He quickly slipped off his backpack and pulled the zipper open. From it, he lifted out a plain spherical metal box about the size of a coffee can and set it on a steel cowling. This was DC, Nex's dual-core nestling bot. It sounded fancy, and it kind of was. Nex built him when he was 11. It took him 3 whole months tinkering away in his father's lab back on Zraynian. It was the first time he really got his hands into nanotechnology, and it had blown his mind wide open. All the possibilities, the things he could make. That was back before the dark days. Now, parts were scarce, and tools for microassembly. Well, he wasn't going to stumble across those in some random spaceport. So DC was probably the last of his kind. At least, the last one Nex would ever make. He never thought he'd be using a droid to stay alive. But without DC, he wouldn't have survived long in the harsh, fast-paced intergalactic spaceways. He tried not to think about what he would do when the bot's internal mechanisms gave out. But for now, the dual-core nestling bot kept him breathing. And from talking to himself. Well, mostly.
DC, bring up the SS Horizon schematic.
Nex instructed. The metal object whirred to life and rose into the air. Its sensors flickered and it rotated several times, orienting itself after its bumpy ride inside Nex's backpack. A small, 3-dimensional holographic map of the ship sprang out from his optical projection module. Nex studied the layout and established the locations of storage compartments and engine rooms relative to his current location. From his previous examination of the map, the crew lockers near the thrusters seemed like the best option. They were out of the way and unlikely to be checked before launch. They were also near some banks of service panels, which would be helpful in the second stage of his mission.
Let's head to the crew lockers.
Nex instructed his robot. DC squeaked and floated along closely behind him as he started through the maze of conduits. They moved quickly and quietly, passing through huge sections of the ship, all disposal and robotic storage bays. The SS Horizon's interior housed mostly current-generation technology, up-to-date enough to pass inspection anyway. The ship's systems creaked and pounded through bulkheads around him. Nex had seen it all before, but every time he looked up at ceilings that vanished above like the night sky, it made him feel so insignificant. Part of him thought it was neat, like sneaking into some giant secret castle. But the other part of him, the part that was into tiny machines, always felt like these large ships had too much wasted space. Finally, they reached the crew lockers, a cramped area near the engine rooms. As Nex suspected, monitoring cameras were few to none in this part of the ship. The lockers were stacked against the walls, each one tagged with an empty slot for a crew member's name. Nex chose an empty locker near the back. Zraynians were much smaller than most humanoids. Still, the locker was barely large enough to accommodate him, his backpack, and DC too. He pulled off his boots and awkward headgear and tossed them into the locker next door. Then he pressed his knees against his backpack, and DC settled on top of his head.
Seriously, DC? You better be on lookout duty up there, because I can barely move.
Through the small vents in the locker door, Nex watched the room outside. Now it was time for his ears to go to work. He leaned back, closed his eyes, and listened as the final checks were completed. The occasional sound of footsteps and muffled voices echoed from somewhere through the walls, and the ship's systems kept up a steady rumble around him. He was near the ship's great fusion thrusters. He could feel the power of the slowly idling thrusters shuddering through his bones. Nex glanced at his wristwatch. Great. He had to stay quiet and not move for about 20 minutes. It sounded easy, but it wasn't. He had been practicing for a while, though, training his muscles to relax in tight spots and to sleep pretty much anywhere. Sleeping wasn't just about staying quiet, though that was a big plus when he was trying not to get caught. It was also about saving energy, which was really important when he hadn't had a proper meal in a couple of days. So now he forced his eyes shut, tried to breathe slowly, and just drifted off. Nex was shaken awake by the heavy thunks of the ship's airlock sealing shut, followed by the hiss of pressurization. The lights in the corridor went dark as the ship switched to its internal power grid. The first time that happened, he nearly panicked. Now he knew what was coming, but still the sudden moment of total darkness gave him the creeps. The ship went silent, signaling the minimization of the life support systems. A soft, automated voice announced,
"Final security protocols initiated. All non-essential systems offline. Launch sequence commencing."
The ship's advanced security systems activated. The external sensors and defenses were operational. One mistake now and, well, it wouldn't be pretty. The ship shook as it detached from the docking clamps, and the countdown began. He had to admit, even though he'd done this before, there was a rush. He didn't know what it was. Maybe it was because he'd made it this far, or maybe it was just that feeling of the next stage. Scary, but exciting at the same time.
10, 9, 8.
He closed his eyes.
7, 6, 5.
The thrusters roared to life, shaking the bulkheads.
2,
Nex
1.
clutched his backpack.
Launch.
The thrusters exploded to life, shoving him forward. All of the metal lockers clattered around him as the drives cycled through thrust calibration. There was no feeling of actual movement with a ship of this size. Nothing but the awesome power of its quivering fusion drives as the supply fleet left the Orbit 7 docking platform. Then, as the initial acceleration subsided, the heavy thudding of the drives backed down and the ion thrusters took over as the ships pushed out of the station into the space above the planet. Nex felt a subtle, almost imperceptible shift as the SS Horizon lumbered into alignment with the hyperspace jump vector. This maneuver sometimes took a while. He closed his eyes, picturing the fleet poised on the edge of normal space. Each second brought him closer to the jump that would fling him across unimaginable distances. Nex braced himself. Any second now. Any second. The transition to hyperspace was like being in two places at the same time. Then the SS Horizon jumped, leaving the normal dimensions of space behind. You've been listening to Darkcore Frontiers. If you enjoyed the story, be sure to subscribe to our YouTube channel, Wondrous Legends. And if you like this production, you can help us make Season 2 by supporting us on Patreon at patreon.com/wondrouslegends. Thank you for listening.